While historical authors faced resistance due to societal taboos around discussing domestic violence, today's authors and filmmakers face scrutiny over how these stories are packaged and sold, especially when they reach a far broader, media-literate audience than in the past. Welcome back to Regency Rumors. I'm Kayla, and here on my channel, I explore period dramas, history, and historical fiction. And in my last video, I told you guys that this video would be lighter, and I lied. Last video, I was talking about plus-size representation in period dramas, and being very defensive of Nicola Coughlan and plus-size actresses that don't always get the roles that they deserve. And so I was like, next video, it's going to be light. It's going to be something fun to do with maybe Victorian history or something. And unfortunately, this video is going to be even heavier than last one. But in my defense, how was I to know that there was going to be a crazy press tour about a rom-com that was going to take over our TikTok feeds? I'm talking about the It Ends With Us press tour based on the book by Colleen Hoover. As an initial disclaimer, I will be talking about domestic violence, or DV, in classic literature, but I will not be talking about any specifics in detail. You may be asking yourself, what does It Ends With Us have to do with the kind of content you make, Kayla? Not very historical, not very period drama of you. Well, you'd be surprised how these things can link up and relate to one another, especially when you're a researcher and a historian like myself, who is always looking at the lens of the future with an eye for the past. I've never read the book, but I was one of those people that when the film came out, I assumed that it was a light rom-com until TikTok told me otherwise. I started to look into the plot and characters of It Ends With Us and found that it included a storyline of domestic violence. It made me think of another novel that had an impact on me when I was in high school, about a woman who leaves her abusive husband for the sake of herself and her child's safety, and that is Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. I'm going to be comparing and contrasting elements of It Ends With Us to The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and how the promotion of these books were both alarming in different ways and affected audiences. Obviously, there's a lot of differences with these books, the author, the plots, the characters, the time periods, etc. But I think there's a lot that can be learnt from the publishing of a Bronte Classic in the 1850s and how domestic violence storylines should be disseminated to audiences today. If you're familiar with Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte or Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, but not this book, I think there's a specific reason. The portrayal of domestic violence in Anne Bronte's novel has likely contributed to its diminished visibility as a classic, even after almost 200 years since its publication. First off, if you're new here, I'm Kayla. I have a PhD in Welsh history, so I love making content around historical topics. I make videos on things like Regency history and reviewing period dramas like Bridgerton. There were quite a few new viewers on my last video. Well, for me, it's a lot of viewers. And I just wanted to say thank you. When you're a really small creator and you're starting out like me, a lot of times you can feel like you're making content into the ether, and sometimes that can be deflating. So it's been really lovely reading your comments and interactions with the last video, so thank you. And if you enjoyed this video and found it interesting, please consider liking and subscribing. So first off, the It Ends With Us drama. I'm just gonna throw you guys straight in there. So It Ends With Us was penned in 2016 by suspense romance author Colleen Hoover and has now sold over 1 million copies worldwide. It's gotten mixed reviews. Honestly, there's a lot of people that do like her books, a lot of people that don't care for her writing, and this video is not going to be critiquing her as an author, but an exploration of how the book has been marketed by her publisher, and now by those involved in the film adaptation. The book follows a woman named Lily Blossom Bloom. That's a mouthful, who grew up in an abusive household and vows that she's never going to get in this situation in her own relationships as an adult. But when she meets and falls in love with a handsome surgeon, she finds herself in an abusive relationship that she struggles to break free from. Lily has a child and leaves her abusive relationship, eventually getting together with a loving, compassionate friend from childhood. The promotion of this book has gotten a lot of criticism. There was an It Ends With Us coloring book, and eventually It Ends With Us nail polish that was sold, which people thought was troubling because of the serious content featured in the book. Some of the marketing of the book resembled that of a light romance novel rather than a more serious psychological one. The film premiered on August 9th, 2024, and it stars Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, who served as producer and director, respectively. On the night of the premiere, people noticed that Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni seemed to be promoting very different versions of the film at separate locations, which was odd. Normally, when you have a film that comes out, the director will be on the red carpet with the cast promoting the film. So right from the get-go, people noticed something was up. Blake arrived in a sparkling dress previously worn by Britney Spears, surrounded by flowers, almost like a pop-up flower shop in a romance film. The atmosphere was bright and floral, and the cast seemed ready to answer light and fun questions. One cast member emphasized how attractive the actors were, suggesting that people should come see the film because of the hot cast, which is a marketing approach similar to films like Anyone But You, a lighthearted romance. I was one of the viewers that saw clips from the premiere and assumed it was a rom-com. The subsequent promotion of It Ends With Us over the next few weeks only got more confusing. In interviews and promos, Blake encouraged audiences to grab your girls and wear your florals, which reinforced the impression that the film was a rom-com. A lot of people online felt as if Blake Lively answered questions around domestic violence with a far too dismissive or light tone, and instead chose to focus on fun humor by focusing on her character's wardrobe and the romance subplot, or by bringing in her husband, Ryan Reynolds, in for comedic interviews. He's well known for having a really funny marketing approach to his films, and so there was some promotional material that was made that he was involved in that was meant to be light and funny. There has been a lot of extra unconfirmed drama around rewritten scripts, fatphobic statements, and clashes on set between the director, Justin Baldoni, and Blake Lively that I'm not going to go into too much detail about. I don't want one person to seem like a good person and one person to seem like a bad person when there could be a lot of details behind closed doors that we don't know about and that we'll never know. But what I am going to say is that from what we can see at some of these events, it felt like the two of them possibly disagreed with the way that the movie should be marketed. This disconnect between Lively and Baldoni's promotional strategies highlighted their differing versions of how the film should be presented. Baldoni's social media posts about DV, and especially a poster he shared, contrasted sharply with the one that was released during the premiere. This dissonance in marketing led to online criticism, with people expressing concern that the film's serious themes were being overshadowed by light, fluffy promotion on Blake Lively's side. The marketing has had an effect on audiences going to the theater, it seems. There have been numerous accounts online from women who went to see the film who had experience with DV or brought an elderly parent or an older teenage daughter with them, expecting a fun movie night with the girls, only to be confronted with scenes of violence. I know I would be upset if I'd gone to the theater expecting a lighthearted romance only to be unprepared for the intense reality of the film's subject matter. It wasn't until I began exploring the actual plot of this film that I started thinking about one of my favorite novels, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and how there were elements and themes of these stories that felt similar to me. I am a bit of a basic white girl. My favorite book is Jane Eyre. I've grown up loving the Bronte sisters. I've read biographies on them and watched documentaries, visited their home in Haworth, so I know a bit about the family history, and it just made me think about what happened with Anne's book after it was published and how the insinuation of domestic violence in the novel was diminished by publishers to make it more palatable and marketable for a 19th century audience. Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall had its own drama in 1848, so I want to explore that drama surrounding her book and discuss how the diminishing of stories about domestic violence was a problem then and remains an issue almost 200 years later. Anne Bronte lived from 1820 to 1849 in Yorkshire in the north of England and was a part of the literary Bronte family. Her sister Charlotte Bronte wrote Jane Eyre, and her other sister, Emily Bronte, wrote Wuthering Heights. The Tenant of Wildfell Hall follows the story of Helen Graham, a mysterious widow who arrives in a small Yorkshire village with her young son and rents a secluded mansion called Wildfell Hall. As rumors about her past begin to spread, local farmer Gilbert Markham becomes intrigued by Helen, developing feelings for her. However, jealousy arises when he mistakenly believes that she's romantically involved with a man named Mr. Lawrence, and after a confrontation, Helen reveals that Mr. Lawrence is her brother, helping her escape from her abusive husband who is still alive. To explain her situation to Gilbert, she gives him her diary, which recounts the harrowing details of her marriage. In her diary, Helen describes her marriage to Arthur Huntington, an initially charming and handsome but manipulative man who quickly reveals his true nature as selfish, abusive, and addicted to alcohol. As their marriage deteriorates, Arthur's behavior becomes increasingly cruel and violent, and even involves their young son in his destructive behaviors, like torturing animals for fun. When Arthur refuses to grant Helen a divorce, she plans to leave him, but her plans are thwarted until her brother helps her escape to Wildfell Hall. Despite Gilbert's feelings for Helen, she tells him that she's not free to marry him, and she returns to her dying husband, who never repents for his actions and dies in despair. Classic Bronte happy plot. A year later, Helen has wealth of her own. She's living in a nice estate, and Gilbert is like, I don't think I'm rich enough to be with her. I'm but a lowly farmer. But when the two of them run into each other, it's clear that there's still love between the two, and eventually, by the end of the novel, they marry. Phew! First off, when comparing It Ends With Us and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, both novels center on white women in their 20s who initially fall for charismatic and charming men only to find themselves in abusive marriages. Despite their efforts to make the relationship work, both women eventually flee their marriages to protect themselves and their children. Alongside this, there's a romantic subplot involving men who perhaps seen by society as less wealthy or successful than the protagonist's husbands at first, but ultimately proved to be better partners. While these stories differ in tone, characters, and time periods, it's striking and sad that fictional women separated by 200 years could face such similar journeys who find the courage to leave their abusers. As I was watching the drama of It Ends With Us unfold, I thought about The Tenant of Wildfell Hall and how Anne Bronte's book had been criticized, heavily edited, and banned at one point in history, and it made me think, why have these people who were involved in marketing these disturbing stories chosen to minimize the seriousness of domestic violence then and now, like during the It Ends With Us press tour? The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was marketed as a sensational and controversial story, with its realism and moral fervor standing in stark contrast to the more romanticized depictions of marriage prevalent in Victorian literature. Despite its commercial success, the novel faced significant backlash for its candid portrayal of a woman's right to escape an abusive marriage, with critics and some of Anne's contemporaries condemning its content as too coarse and subversive for the time. You might be shocked to hear that perhaps Wildfell Hall's biggest critic was Anne's own sister Charlotte, author of Jane Eyre. In a time when all three sisters thought it best to keep their names concealed and instead publish under a male pseudonym, Charlotte thought her sister's radical book was a mistake. In a letter to her publisher in 1850, she said, "It hardly seemed to me desirable that a narrative so revolting should be thrust into the world, yet it contained such power, such directness, such truth, that the reader was constrained to admire while he recoiled." So why was Charlotte so critical of her sister's book? There's a couple different reasons why Bronte scholars believe Charlotte disapproved of the content in Wildfell Hall. Firstly, she could have thought that the insinuation of domestic violence was too grim and inappropriate to be written in fiction for public discussion, and that Anne's book was not a good example of well-written literature. During the Victorian period, conversations around private matters such as a toxic relationship between a married couple was seen as unseemly, especially in fiction. Charlotte could have believed that Anne's unflinchingly realistic depictions of domestic abuse could tarnish their literary reputation and bring criticism onto the family. Charlotte's book contained elements of romanticism and nuance in her storytelling, and Anne's book was more grounded in realism and social critique, so Charlotte could have thought that her sister's work was too stark and unrefined. Lastly, Charlotte could have thought that it mirrored real-life scenarios within their family or people within their community, which she didn't think would be appropriate to fictionalize or publicize. Like Helen's husband, Arthur, Anne and Charlotte's brother, Branwell Bronte, struggled with addiction and self-destructive behavior that affected everyone in their family for years, until his violent death at the age of 30 in 1848. His alcoholism and an uncovered affair with a wealthy married woman, and his and Anne's employer to boot, might not have been a storyline that Charlotte wanted aired out in fiction through Helen and Arthur's story. Scholars are torn on whether the Tenant of Wildfell Hall was based on anything in Anne's life, but there are possibilities such as her brother or the story of a local woman. The Bronte sisters' father, Patrick Bronte, was a rector in Haworth in Yorkshire. A parishioner at Patrick's church named Mrs. Collins came to Patrick for advice about her violent husband. His advice for her was unconventional for the time. He advised her to leave her husband. This advice was significant because it contrasted with more common 19th century views that women should remain with their husbands despite any hardships, including abuse. Patrick Bronte's progressive stance on this matter may have impacted Anne to write about Helen Huntington leaving her husband. Under English law at the time, a married woman was not legally independent from her husband. She couldn't own property or petition for a divorce or have sole custody of her children. Helen could have been charged with kidnapping her son and be forced to reconcile with her husband. In the book, Helen tries to support herself and her son through painting, which technically was illegal at the time. She would not have been allowed to work legally, as any of the income she would have made would have been stealing her husband's property. So this shows you just how radical it was for Wildfell Hall to be published during this time. And it could have been that Charlotte didn't want Anne's book to be a source of gossip and side-eyeing from people they knew about either their family's view on the subject or what went on behind closed doors. Whatever the reason, Charlotte had the Tenant of Wildfell Hall banned from shelves after Anne's death in 1849. Anne Bronte died at the age of 29, which is so sad because all of the sisters died at a young age. The whole family story is just tragic. She had Anne's other book, Agnes Grey, reprinted, but not the Tenant of Wildfell Hall, saying, "Wildfell Hall, it hardly appears to me desirable to preserve. The choice of subject in that work is a mistake. It was too little consonant with the character, taste, and ideas of the gentle, retiring, inexperienced writer."
Guess who's jealous of Adele? Beyonce.
Other writers criticized the book heavily, specifically about its implications of domestic violence. William Makepeace Thackeray, who wrote Vanity Fair, believed that Anne's realism was far too obvious and her depictions of immorality and suffering to be too uncomfortably direct. Elizabeth Rigby, a prominent critic and essayist in the mid-1800s, condemned the Tenant of Wildfell Hall for its coarseness and vulgarity, and she believed that it was an inappropriate subject for literature. She believed that the novel's depiction of a woman leaving her husband to be socially unacceptable and morally problematic. During her lifetime, Anne did try and hit back at her critics, believing that writing these characters as they would have been in life was important, saying in the introduction of the second edition of Wildfell Hall, "When we have to do with vice and vicious characters, I maintain it is better to depict them as they really are than as they would wish to appear. To represent a bad thing in its least offensive light is doubtless the most agreeable course for a writer of fiction to pursue. But is it the most honest or the safest? Is it better to reveal the snares and pitfalls of life to the young and thoughtless traveler, or to cover them with branches and flowers?" O reader, If there were less of this delicate concealment of facts, this whispering, peace, peace, when there is no peace, there would be less of sin and misery to the young of both sexes who are left to wring their bitter knowledge from experience. To me, Anne believed that shining a light on the reality of the world around her was better than minimizing it or concealing what really went on in some marriages. By writing such a novel, people could be aware of the kind of injustices that were happening at the time to women, even ones in upper-class households living in grand estates like Helen Huntington. Anne defended her decision to portray domestic violence and verbal abuse in a realistic manner because she believed that sugarcoating such behavior would be dishonest and undermine the moral message of her work. Anne Bronte also hit back at critics who believed that women should not be writing about such subjects. She said, "If a book is a good one, it is so whatever the sex of the author may be. All novels are, or should be, written for both men and women to read. I am at a loss to conceive how a man should permit himself to write anything that would be really disgraceful to a woman, or why a woman should be censured for writing anything that would be proper and becoming for a man." For someone who was characterized as gentle, quiet, and subdued, Anne Bronte was vocal about her goals in writing The Tenant of Wildfell Hall during her short lifetime, no matter the criticisms. She rejected the idea that writing her book was purely for entertainment or to conform to societal expectations. "If I can gain the public ear at all, I would rather whisper a few wholesome truths therein than much soft nonsense." I kind of would like that framed. I interpret these quotes as Anne wishing to use her platform as a writer to convey moral lessons, even if it meant addressing uncomfortable or controversial topics. She believed that an honest portrayal of these issues would have had a more profound impact on readers than a sanitized version. Despite these wishes, however, after Anne's death, she had no control over how her book would be disseminated and marketed. Her sister Charlotte decided in subsequent reprints that Anne's introduction, hitting back at her critics and explaining her reasons for showing elements such as domestic violence, were omitted. In the 1857 edition, many aspects of the writing was softened or left out, such as verbal and emotional abuse, depictions of violent alcoholism, and Arthur's adultery, to make it seem as if the main character's experience was not as serious as Anne's original writing. These mutilated copies are still in circulation today. The full extent of these changes was not completely documented at the time, but modern scholarly efforts have restored the text to its original form as written by Anne Bronte. It wasn't until 1992 that Oxford University Press reprinted what they believed to be a restored version, including all the original scenes and dialogue that were cut out or changed in the 1857 edition, allowing readers to experience the novel as Anne intended. I am of the opinion that decisions made on the publication and dissemination of The Tenant of Wildfell Hall after Anne's death have directly impacted it being a lesser-known novel than Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights. The controversy around the It Ends With Us press tour underscores the responsibility that comes with telling stories about domestic violence. Just as Anne Bronte's The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was a pioneering work that demanded readers take domestic violence seriously, today's creators are being called to account for ensuring that these stories are handled with respect and the seriousness that they deserve. When I was researching this topic, I found that domestic violence and emotional abuse storylines where women are trying to leave their abusive marriages, the authors of those novels have received censorship or a banning of their books throughout history because of the subject matter surrounding women or abuse in marriages. Authors such as Thomas Hardy and Kate Chopin in the 1890s wrote books that featured women in abusive relationships, which were banned in several places or highly criticized. Thomas Hardy had to self-censor his book Test of the D'Urbervilles for it to get published. Like Anne, Kate Chopin's book The Awakening fell into obscurity because of the controversy of its content before re-emerging in the 20th century. Authors into the 1980s, such as Alice Walker, who wrote The Color Purple, faced outrage and banning of her books overriding African-American female characters suffering suffering from abuse in a deeply racist society. Thankfully, much has evolved since the 19th century, so much so that topics like DV can be included in mainstream romance novels without censorship. Now, what it seems to me with the promotion of It Ends With Us is that there's this ongoing tension between the desire to create engaging, marketable, entertaining storylines and the need to respect and accurately portray serious social issues. While historical authors faced resistance due to societal taboos around discussing domestic violence, today's authors and filmmakers face scrutiny over how these stories are packaged and sold, especially when they reach a far broader, media-literate audience than in the past. This reflects a cultural shift where the content itself might be accepted and read, but how it's handled and portrayed in the public sphere is under greater examination. Authors like Anne Bronte encountered public outrage for challenging societal norms through her depictions of domestic abuse because at the time those issues were meant to be swept under the rug. But now that societal norms have shifted and modern audiences are more aware of and sensitive to how serious issues like domestic violence are, authors like Hoover are being challenged to treat storylines with care and responsibility through their books and the promotion of their adaptations. Books like It Ends With Us and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall are proof that stories can be serious, romantic, heartwarming, and alarming, all at the same time. But the more appealing aspects of these novels, such as their romance subplots, shouldn't overshadow the gravity of their subject matter when being pitched to potential audiences. While I'm not saying one way or another that some of the people who were involved didn't consider the seriousness of the content of the novel, there are interviews where DV is spoken about or where some of the struggles that Lily Blossom Bloom goes through are mentioned, so I don't want to pretend like it wasn't ever spoken of at all, but it is clear that perhaps the modern marketing and the need for product promotion for this film got in the way of the central messaging of the film in favor of a sea of flowery advertising, which is a shame because I went to see It Ends With Us the other night and I enjoyed the film. I think the film showed the physical and psychological effects of DV, and the story in the film itself shows that you can have romance and a plot like this, but still take DV very seriously. Anne Bronte's story of publishing The Tenant of Wildfell Hall is a lesson that there was a time in which the realities of domestic violence were heavily censored, swept under the rug, and criticized in literature in favor of more romanticized novels. The criticism of the It Ends With Us press tour serves as a modern reflection of the ongoing challenges that come with addressing domestic violence in literature and media. Whether it's the battle against censorship and societal norms in the 19th century or the need for sensitive marketing in the 21st century, authors and creators continue to navigate complex cultural landscapes when bringing these crucial stories to the public. This highlights the enduring importance of responsibility in storytelling, ensuring that the gravity of domestic violence is never again diminished, erased, or misrepresented. Thank you for watching.